Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. Start with energy and internal stability inside Russia. Fuel supply issues are no longer just an abstract wartime inconvenience. They are showing up in real, everyday disruption. Reports continue to point to shortages, long queues at gas stations in multiple regions, and in some cases, local rationing. What makes this more significant is that it is happening in parallel with a tightening information environment around fuel data itself, including restrictions on the publication of detailed regional pricing statistics. That kind of move is usually a signal worth paying attention to. When transparency gets reduced during a period of rising prices and shortages, it tends to suggest concern about perception as much as supply. And this connects directly to what Ukraine has been doing. Kiev's long-range strike campaign is not just continuing, it is expanding in scope and consistency. Ukrainian forces are targeting oil refineries, fuel storage infrastructure, transport corridors, and industrial sites tied into Russia's defense production network. Some of these strikes are reaching well beyond the traditional frontline geography, including targets more than 1,000 kilometers deep inside Russian territory. The key point here is not the individual strikes themselves, it's the accumulation effect. Over time, repeated pressure on refining capacity and logistics networks starts to produce systemic friction. Fuel doesn't just disappear in one place, it gets redistributed, delayed, or constrained across the entire network. And that is where the strategic impact starts to show up. Because when a country like Russia begins to experience localized fuel strain, it creates trade-offs. Military logistics, civilian consumption, export obligations, and regional distribution all start competing for the same constrained supply chain. That forces prioritization decisions at the state level. Now layer on Ukraine's broader strike pattern. Beyond fuel infrastructure, Ukrainian operations are also targeting communications hubs, radar systems, rail connections, and logistics infrastructure in occupied territories and inside Russia itself. Some of the reported targets include facilities tied to military coordination and surveillance systems that support operations inside Ukraine. What stands out is that Ukraine is increasingly treating the depth of the Russian system as an operational battle space, not just the front line. That includes energy, transportation, and command infrastructure. The result is a war that is being fought across a distributed network rather than a single continuous front. And while that is happening, Russia continues its own strike campaign against Ukraine, but with a slightly different emphasis. Russian drone and missile activity remains persistent and widespread, with repeated strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, including energy and fuel-related targets. There are also continued reports of strikes affecting civilian sites, including fuel stations in frontline regions. Ukrainian officials describe this as an attempt to disrupt civilian mobility and create pressure on daily life rather than purely military degradation. So you've got both sides working the same category of targets, but for different strategic effects. One is trying to stretch military capacity and internal logistics. The other is trying to impose pressure on civilian resilience and infrastructure stability. Now step back to the broader geopolitical layer, because Europe's role in this is quietly expanding in a way that matters long-term. European governments are increasingly funding not just general military aid, but specific capability development inside Ukraine. A growing portion of support is being directed toward drone systems, production capacity, and long-range strike capabilities. That matters because it signals a structural shift. Ukraine is not just being resupplied, it is being industrially reinforced as a persistent long-term military actor. And drones in particular are becoming central to how this war is being fought. They are cheap relative to traditional systems, scalable, and able to operate in contested environments where larger platforms struggle. That means they are not a niche capability anymore. They are part of the core architecture of the conflict. This also feeds back into Russia's internal defense burden. As Ukraine expands its ability to strike deep, Russia is forced to expand its defensive footprint deeper inside its own territory. That means more air defense coverage, more resource allocation for infrastructure protection, and more strain on already stretched logistics systems. It's not just about intercepting threats. It's about building an ever-expanding defensive shell around critical infrastructure. And that shell is expensive to maintain. Now bring in the intelligence and external cooperation layer, because this is becoming more relevant. There are reports pointing to expanded military-to-military engagement between Russia and China, including training activity in sensitive domains like chemical, biological, and radiological defense. Senior-level participation on both sides has been reported in some of these exchanges, suggesting this is not purely symbolic cooperation. The significance here is not that China is entering the war directly. It is that military knowledge transfer is occurring in areas tied to high-end conflict scenarios. That matters for future force development, doctrine sharing, and potentially interoperability in certain domains. Even without direct battlefield alignment, that kind of cooperation changes the strategic backdrop that NATO planners have to account for. Now zoom back into Europe and the security environment around NATO's eastern flank. There is growing concern among NATO members about hybrid pressure operations, particularly in states bordering Russia or heavily involved in supporting Ukraine. These concerns include information operations designed to inflame internal tensions, as well as potential sabotage or disruption activities targeting infrastructure or politically sensitive locations. At the same time, maritime tensions in the Baltic region continue to rise. There have been reports of armed security presence on Russian-linked civilian shipping operating in contested or closely monitored waters. That reflects a broader shift where commercial and civilian infrastructure is increasingly being treated as part of a strategic signaling environment. In parallel, Russia has taken steps to reduce physical connectivity with neighboring NATO countries by closing certain rail crossings. While these moves are framed in administrative or security terms, the effect is clear: fewer cross-border logistics links and a harder separation between Russia and the European system. Now let's briefly touch the battlefield layer, but only in terms of what it tells us strategically. The front lines in eastern and northern Ukraine remain highly active, especially in areas like Donetsk and Kharkiv sectors. Russian forces continue to rely heavily on small unit infiltration tactics, drone support, and sustained artillery pressure rather than large armored breakthroughs. The intent appears to be attritional, constant pressure designed to slowly erode defensive positions rather than produce rapid territorial gains. Ukrainian forces, in response, are relying heavily on layered defense systems combined with rapid counterattacks when exposed opportunities appear. The result is a front line that is under constant pressure but not producing decisive breakthroughs for either side. So what matters here is not movement, but durability. Both sides are testing how long systems can hold under continuous strain. Inside Russia, there is also an expanding internal security and legal dimension tied to the war. Reports continue to show prosecutions and long prison sentences for individuals accused of espionage, sabotage, or cooperation with Ukrainian intelligence services. These cases are being used to reinforce internal discipline and signal the consequences of engaging with external actors. At the same time, broader security enforcement trends suggest the state is treating internal stability as part of the operational battle space. That includes monitoring infrastructure vulnerability and tightening control over information flows related to military and economic conditions. And finally, there is a quieter but important structural issue developing in Russia's civilian aviation sector. Aircraft availability and operational capacity are under strain due to maintenance constraints and parts supply challenges. The impact is uneven across carriers, but the overall direction points toward reduced capacity and higher operational costs. Over time, that creates additional pressure on domestic mobility, logistics, and commercial connectivity. When you stack that on top of fuel constraints and infrastructure stress, you get a broader picture of incremental but widening economic friction. Thanks for listening. If this was useful, a quick review or comment helps others find the show. For deeper coverage, check out our daily intel brief on Substack at restrictedhandling.substack.com. Have a great day.